When someone dies, we are required, indeed compelled, to live with circumstances that we would love to be able to change, but sadly cannot. When confronted by any challenge in life, most of us try to think, what can I do? But when someone dies, there is nothing we can do to change the outcome. The question for many then becomes, what do you do when there's nothing you can do? While that may seem contradictory, it is a very real issue. One of the things we often do when there is nothing we can do is to feel guilty. Why do we do this? Here is a surprising grief guideline. People would rather feel guilty than feel helpless. Listen to what Maureen wrote after the death of her husband.
6 weeks ago, my husband died after having a major heart attack at work. The night before, we had a serious argument concerning our daughter because I felt he wasn't strict enough with her. We hardly ever had a cross word, but the argument went on, and we went to bed angry with each other. I didn't get up and make his lunch the next morning, and we hadn't made it up before he left for work. I didn't even kiss him goodbye. Ever since, it has gone round and round in my head. I feel he might be alive now if we hadn't had that silly argument. I keep thinking, if only I'd kissed him and made up before he left, he'd still be with us. I feel angry with my daughter for being the cause of the row, and I'll never be able to forgive myself for what happened. How can I face the years of guilt and unhappiness which lie ahead?
When a death occurs in such unfortunate circumstances, it's difficult to accept. At one level, Maureen is saying, if only we hadn't had that argument, if only I'd gotten up and seen him off, then this wouldn't have happened. How she must have wished for one more hour to put things right, to say sorry, to say goodbye. You see, a sudden death tends to isolate and freeze the final experiences in the relationship and tends to highlight what was happening at the time of the death. This often causes last-minute situations to be out of proportion with the rest of the relationship. Possibly the argument brought on the heart attack, but there again, maybe the heart attack brought on the argument. Many factors can trigger a heart attack which has already become inevitable. Maybe her husband wasn't feeling very well that evening and was a bit grumpy and argumentative. We'll never know. Even in situations that may not be as unfortunate as the one we have just heard about, people have feelings of guilt. Many times over the years, I've heard people tell their story of a positive and enjoyable relationship they shared with someone they cared about. Nothing's ever perfect, of course, but things were good. And then that person dies. Looking at the situation, observers might conclude that people had done everything they could for their loved one, and that they should be happy and satisfied. But after the death, they will often say, I feel so guilty.
On one level, I knew I had done everything I could, and yet I felt so guilty. I kept asking myself, what more could I have done for her? What if we had gone to a different doctor? What if I had been more patient and less irritable? All the what ifs and if onlys. I felt so guilty because I felt like I should have done more.
Why does a person feel guilty, even when on the surface they may not appear to be guilty? In a situation where there is nothing we can do, we try to discover what we could have done. If only I'd done this. What if I'd done that? I should have done things differently. I could have done something else or something more. Guilt gives us a feeling of control. If only I'd done this, if only I'd done that, what if I'd done something different? If only we'd gone to the doctor sooner. If only we had not allowed them to go out the night of the accident. And how many if-onlys can you think of?
I think there's always guilt when you lose a loved one, especially in a tragedy. I look back at when I first recognized depression in Michael. I'm not one to leave a problem alone. Sometimes I'm at the point of being a nuisance to try to solve a problem. And perhaps I was with Michael. I was a nuisance at trying to solve his problem. But over a period of 4.5 years, I feel comfortable in saying I've tried everything under the sun. I tried everything I can possibly do, what one person can do. But let me tell you, after all is said and done, the guilt feelings are still there. What else could I have done? What didn't I do? Why didn't I tie him up and force him into a hospital? I mean, there's some extreme thoughts here. But let me tell you something. If I could have clubbed him over the head, tied him up, and brought him into a hospital and have him here today, I would do it.
Each if only assumes that if something had been done, that the outcome could have been changed. It expresses itself in terms of actions that might have made a difference. You'll notice how many times the words do and done have arisen in this section. Guilt says, I did not do enough to prevent the death or change the circumstances, and is often an attempt to punish myself for what I did not do, but could have done, should have done, might have done, something, anything that could have changed the outcome. Guilt gives us a feeling of control, because if I'd done more to manage the situation, I could have changed it. But maybe that's an illusion of control.
Well, the biggest guilt again is how come I didn't notice anything before? But then he could hide it from me. He did. I mean, from there on, I was like a mother hen, trying to save what I could, protect him. But there was nothing anyone could have done. Very disappointed in myself. How can you fall asleep in that night when they won't let you go home? And you should have known that something terrible or something big is going to happen. And I fell asleep. As of today, I didn't forgive myself for that.
I have come to realize that there is a big difference between being guilty and feeling guilty. Many people feel at fault, even though there may not be much evidence to suggest that they are to blame. Two things are important here. First, the reality is that probably very little would be different. And secondly, there's nothing we can do to change it now. Ah, yes, but we would rather believe that we could have done something than accept that we are helpless to do anything. So the grieving person uses their if-onlys to see where they could have assumed more control over the situation. What makes it even more difficult is the rationalizations we offer to counteract the if-onlys have very little effect. We can say that hindsight is 20/20. We can point out that sometimes people do go to the doctor sooner, and sometimes there's nothing the doctor can do. Sometimes people get sick and die. Tragedies occur. Stuff happens. But it's difficult for us to think of fate as being arbitrary. So we try what we could do or could have done to gain some control over the situation. It's important to see that the issue here is not guilt. It is really our sense of helplessness and powerlessness. We need to come to terms with guilt because it is a negative and counterproductive emotion. We are blaming ourselves for not doing something that was most probably beyond our control. I believe that forgiveness is the key to effectively dealing with guilt and blame and anger. Now, forgiveness works on many different levels. While I understand that not everyone believes in God, traditionally, people of faith find comfort in experiencing God's forgiveness. But one way or another, whether we include God in our belief system or not, we all need to learn the meaning of the word forgiveness. Sometimes people feel guilty because they are guilty of something, and asking forgiveness of the person we have hurt, righting the wrong and making changes is something you may need to consider, even if that person is the deceased. But more often than not, people feel guilty without being guilty. So where does forgiveness fit in there? Sometimes we need to find a way to forgive ourselves. A great deal of the guilt and anger and blame is because we cannot fix the situation. I wish there was more I could do, is the sentiment, leaving us feel guilty that we were not able to do enough to change things. My friend, you need to forgive yourself for being human. Part of our humanity is our inability to change or fix all situations and circumstances. Tragedies happen, and as much as we might like to prevent them or have them happen to us rather than our loved ones, we have no control over these things. Some things in life are beyond human control. Can you accept that this is part of our human limitation? Goodness knows that you would do anything to change this, but nothing will be sufficient. You see, guilt is really an emotional setup. Guilt says, I should have done more. But here's my question. When it comes to someone you love, how much is enough? When you've done 1,001 things for someone you love, the problem is it never feels like it's enough. No matter how much you do, there's always going to be one more thing. Here's where guilt swindles us. When you've done everything for someone you love, you always wish you could do one more thing. Why is it that we always seem to focus on the one thing we didn't do and forget the 1,001 things we did do? We need to concentrate on remembering the things we were able to do and let the rest go. Because the setup is that there's always going to be something else. I can only hope that Maureen was able to remember the good life she had with her husband and let that one thing go. I love the truths contained in the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Serenity is a combination of acceptance and empowerment. It isn't simply acquiescence, nor is it control over uncontrollable things. It encourages us to accept the things that cannot be changed. And what are those things? Perhaps one is that your loved one has died and that there is nothing you can do to change it. But what are the things I can change? We may not be able to alter the circumstances, but we can always change how we are affected by them. What can I do to make the most of what I have left? That you can control. Can I be thankful for what I did do, rather than beating myself up over things that I didn't do or more likely couldn't do?